Um, yeah, so good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Firstly, let me just say apologies. This presentation will be in English, not in German. The FPR is, let's say, a little bit complicated, and if I do the presentation in German, it might raise more questions than that it might answer. My name is Giel Tettelaar. I'm the chairman of the EFCI register. We are one of the now 5, actually, notified bodies that are appointed and accredited to do certification for biostimulants. We're based in the Netherlands. What I want to talk to you about today is obviously the FPR, but very specifically, how can you actually get a product certified? So very briefly, because the other speakers spoke on it as well, just shortly about the FPR. The goal of the regulation is to create a single market for fertilizing products, and biostimulants is one of the types of products that is now included in that regulation. The regulation is optional, which is quite unique. It means if you're selling a biostimulant at the moment, under, for example, a national registration in France or in Spain, you can keep doing that. But on top of this, from the 16th of July, you can choose to use the FPR to sell a biostimulant. So it doesn't replace national rules. It just provides an additional framework that you can work under. Like Teresa mentioned earlier, the regulation splits products up into a PFC. There are 7 of these. Obviously interesting for today is we have PFC 6, which is biostimulants. And there are 2 categories that you can choose. You can have a microbial biostimulant or a non-microbial biostimulant. And you have to have one or the other, and then you have to meet those requirements. And there are, of course, CMCs. So the ingredients that you use to formulate your product have to meet certain requirements. Important for the day, there's no form of national registration. Instead, there's a system of certification. There's CE marking, but there are also modules. And the modules define how you get a product certified, what requirements you have to meet, and how you can actually start selling the product. In the case of biostimulants, you have to get certification and you have to choose either module B or module D1. The difference is module B just looks at the technical design of a product. So it's a remote and document-based audit. It's a bit simpler. But module D1 looks at the management system. That means that a notified body visits your company once every year and audits all the production locations. It typically, for a biostimulant company, module B is more efficient. It's an easier module to choose because we do the audit once and then you get a certificate and there's no form of reassessment for at least 5 years. But of course, if you have a large portfolio of products, D1 could potentially be economically more interesting. In some cases, depending on the ingredients that you use, it will be required to choose module D1 to sell your product. In both cases, you will have to employ a notified body. The FPR is, of course, the first time that a truly comprehensive framework for biostimulants has been defined at EU level. It provides a system of certification, labeling, market access, and everything else. Thus, it's quite unique. Thus, there are, of course, a lot of questions, and we're happy to help in that regard. What the FPR also introduces is CE marking. Teresa also already mentioned it allows you to, if you sell under FPR and you have the certification, you can affix the CE marking to your product. So, if we look specifically about getting to market, a lot of you might be used to national registration authorities to do approval either for biostimulants in specific countries or, of course, plant protection products. In the case of FPR, you can see notified bodies as the new type of registration authority. They are private. So like I said, we are one of the 5. If you want certification for a biostimulant, you can work with us, or you can choose one of the other 5 companies. And we expect during the course of next year that more notified bodies, including some from Germany, will become listed on the NANDO list. So you can choose the notified body. In theory, and what we see in practice as well, is that is quite a pragmatic approach. It means you can find an authority that you like to work with that maybe speaks your language or responds quite quickly. It means we keep one another sharp, and it means notified bodies inherently have to be approachable. So if you send us a question, you'll get a response within a few days rather than weeks or months, and we do want to help. In essence, the system for getting a product to market in FPR is quite simple. You submit a dossier to a notified body. If they approve the file, you get a certificate, and that allows you to sell in the entirety of the EU. So there's no specific national rules that you have to meet. You do it once, you get the certificate, and you're done. The certificate will be valid for 3 to 5 years, depending on both the notified body and the module. And what's important is that the module you choose, it doesn't make a difference for the acceptance. Whether you have a certificate for B or D1, either one is valid. Either one allows you to sell the product, and it allows you to sell the product in every European country. The potential of that is obviously that it could possibly, through a single system of approval, greatly expand the market potential for your products. What's important to note is once you're certified, the obligations don't stop there. Market surveillance is a big part of FPR, and national governments will be testing products. They will be taking products off shelves and checking whether you meet the requirements. And they can do that a year after you've sold a product, 2 years, 3 years, doesn't matter. They can come up with a plan. They can take one of your products off the shelf. And if that product doesn't meet the requirements of the FPR, you could possibly have a problem. So it's an ongoing obligation. There's also requirements to hold the technical information for at least 5 years after a sale. So you have to be aware that there are specific obligations, not just to get certified, but also to hold records. In the case of module B and D1, if you change a product, so if you change the formulation, if you add an ingredient, you have to report that to the notified body, and you have to have the notified body assess that change. If you just, for example, open a new production location, especially under module B, that won't be required to be reported. But if you change the formulation, you have to have it reassessed. The FPR, and because it's part of the legal framework for CE marking, means there is a lot of responsibility for the manufacturer. Thomas already said there's technical specifications, but in truth, you don't even have to use those specifications. If you want to use other standards or different standards for analysis, for proving claims, all of that is in the hands of the manufacturer, and a lot of the legal responsibility is also in the hands of the manufacturer. So if something goes wrong, it's not the notified body's problem per se, or it's still your responsibility as a manufacturer. That's something definitely to watch out for. Obviously, in this sector, if someone comes in and says there's a simple system of registration, there's always the question, what's the catch? And in truth, the system, if it works efficiently and if you have all the documentation, is as pragmatic as I just described it. There is no catch. Getting a certificate, in essence, is quite simple, and it's quite straight to the point, and it can be done quite quickly, and it only requires a few documents. So I just want to run through them quickly to get you an idea. You need a test report proving that the product contains or doesn't contain certain contaminants and pathogens. You need to have information per ingredient that it meets the requirements of the chosen CMC. So you need to send us an example of the label. You need to send us some details on, at a very high level, the manufacturing process. And of course, for a biostimulant, you have to define what the product actually does. So you have to define claims and you have to prove them. How you prove them is somewhat up to you. Usually it'll be field trials, but if you want to submit a dossier with literature studies to a notified body, in theory, that's also allowed. If you send us this information, we send it to one of our auditors. This is obviously in the case of module B. The auditor will assess it, and within 2 to 4 weeks, if the file meets the requirements, we can handle the paperwork and issue the certificate. So the process can be quite quick. Of course, if we're still waiting on information, or if you still have to do field trials, it'll take as long as it takes. Similar to the costs. So it depends a little bit, obviously, on the notified body you choose, because they're private. Just from our example, with us, you get a price up front, and that's fixed. And so for a biostimulant, the costs for getting a product certified will be between 2,000 and 3,500 euros. The 3,500 euros is pretty much very much really the top limit. But that's for very complicated products or for manufacturers that have not done any form of preparation. Usually the costs are about 2,500 euros. That, of course, gets you a certificate that's valid for 5 years. And so if you keep making that product, you don't have to do a reassessment. And after 5 years, and this is something specific to us, if you haven't changed the product, you get a recertification for free. So in essence, the certificate is valid for as long as you keep making that same product. Of course, if you change the product, you have to do a reassessment. In that regard, if you can spread the costs out, it is still manageable. Same with the timeline. So if we look at our specific company process and how we would handle the certification, this is the best way for me to explain how would it actually work and how straight to the point and simple this process can in reality be. Let's say after the conference, you want to start with one product, and that's your right, because it's optional. You can apply a single product, send us a file, and then just as a trial. What we always do with manufacturers is set up a Teams call just to get an idea. What are your questions? What are you running into? What are you unsure about? And that's where we always help. So that's typically an hour and a half where we just run through what are your specific products? What are you worried about? Give you the answer to your questions, and then see if the process is something that you want to pursue. If it is, you obviously get all the information you need to get started. So the contract that we typically sign, the pricing, everything up front, and it's fixed. So you know inherently what you're going into. Of course, if it's something you want to continue with, fill in the application form, sign the contract. That's step one. Until the contract is signed, all the information is non-binding. So if you just want to know something, feel free to send us a question. And until the contract, we can give you all the information that you need. So that's also an open offer to everyone in the room. Once we've signed the contract, what we ask from you is you just send in the documentation. Simple, via email or via WeTransfer. Send in all the information that I just listed. So the test reports, the field trial reports, the label, the dossier per CMC, and we evaluate that. If there are any points, you'll get a report from the auditor on which points he or she might not have found enough evidence that you meet the requirements. You get that presented in a very simple list, and you can go and fix that. Those points, those nonconformities, those aren't concerning. That's not an issue. You can take as long as you want to fix it, and it's not something to be worried about. And of course, if the product already meets the requirements, simple. Then we go straight to phase 3, which is that we review the documents internally and issue the certificate. Obviously, with the first product, a lot of manufacturers are running into a lot of questions. Once you get an idea what's required, the process becomes very simple to run through, because then it becomes predictable. Just from our side, some of the questions that we've already run into, some of the questions that I'm sure you have as well, and that I wanted to present because I think they are important, and if I'm honest, they make a lot of sense. We see these questions from a lot of manufacturers, and I'm sure you're running into them as well. Do you have to do field trials? Probably yes. The standard has a big preference for field trials, but if you have literature studies or if you have other forms of evidence that you say prove a particular function, a particular claim, that's allowed. So you're allowed to submit that to the notified body. The worst that will happen is that we simply say we don't see enough evidence. So that's a discussion you have to have with the auditor, but the room exists and you're allowed to do that. Is there a standard that you can test your field trials, maybe that you already performed against? Yes, there is. I've actually put it on the screen as well. It's this technical specification, that family. That's a family of 5 standards that contain the specific criteria for doing field trials and for proving specific claims. So if you want some more information on, maybe the field trials you've already done and do they meet the requirements, buy those specific standards, those 5, read through them and see against your own field trial reports, do our reports contain all the information that is listed in the standard? If it does, there's a good chance you can start certification with them. Can we review field trial designs? So maybe you're in the process of just getting started. Yes, we can. Simply put, if you haven't done any field trials, you want to start certification and you want to know upfront that the trials you do meet the requirements, we can approve them upfront before actually doing the trials. What do you have to do for the risk assessment? Because the FPR includes the requirement to send a risk assessment to a notified body. In truth, you do have to send us a document somehow explaining what the risks are of the product, but we don't actually evaluate it because there's no requirement for doing that. So the risk assessment is something that's more for you internally to check what are the specific risks of the product. If there aren't any, simple, that's it. CMC 7 and 10. So obviously, if you have microorganisms that are not on the list, unfortunately, you can't certify those biostimulants. So if you have a microbial biostimulant with a microorganism in that's not in one of the four families included in the CMC 7 list, unfortunately, for now, we can't do the certification. Same with CMC 10. If you have products that use animal byproducts, unfortunately, at the moment, we can only start the certification, but we can't complete it because we're still waiting on an additional delegated act. Can you use existing test reports, for example, based on German national rules? Yes. If you have test reports from Veda Lufa, we accept them. Same with claims. Can you add additional claims later on in the process? Yes. So let's say you start with a specific claim for broadacre crops, nutrient use efficiency, and then after half a year, you want to expand that so that the product has a claim for any crop group. You simply send in the additional test reports, so just that bit, we reevaluate the certificate and give you an updated certificate. So that process is quite simple as well, and of course the costs are a lot lower than the initial certification. Same with adding claims during certification. If you do the field trials and then maybe you order some additional ones and there were the product does more than what you initially expected, until the certificate is issued, you can basically send in evidence, and as long as you prove a particular claim, you can go as expansive as you want during the process. So that there's nothing that's fixed up front in that regard. About notified bodies, are there delays? Are there backlogs? I obviously can't speak for everyone. In truth, at the moment, I don't think there are many backlogs. Especially with biostimulants, we have a lot of interest, but there's a lot of companies still doing field trials. So that 2 to 4 week timeline that I mentioned earlier, we'll probably be able to guarantee that for at least the next few months. Could there be backlogs in the future? Yes, but there will also be more notified bodies in the future. So we don't expect that to be too big of a problem. But of course, that's just with our specific situation. Maybe with other companies, they are facing backlogs. So far, we haven't heard too many issues from that. And then the last one, which was a question that I want to thank Teresa for supplying. If you have a dealer, so you sell a product and you have a dealer that rebrands that product, what does they have to do? The truth is, if they rebrand it and they sell it under their own name, they become the manufacturer, which means they will need somehow to have access to the technical documentation. Now, that can be done through a letter of access. If you really like your dealer, you can just send them all the technical information, which I assume is not something that you want to do. But in truth, either a letter of access or somehow or another, you have to have them have access to the technical documentation, or they have to stop rebranding the product and they have to sell it as your initial brand and add the labeling branded repackaged by. But if they resell the product in their own name, they become the manufacturer, and so all the legal responsibilities of that they have to meet, unfortunately. What I will say is this was obviously just let's say a sample of our inbox in terms of frequently asked questions. What I really say for anyone in the room today is if you have a question, if there's something about FPR that you want to know or getting a product certified, do please reach out to us. We're happy to set up the necessary calls. It's not like we're going to charge you for that. We're happy to give off all the necessary information, and we want a lot of the unclarity that exists in the sector. We want to take that away. And so if there's anything that you want to know, either during the conference, feel free to approach me, and otherwise send us an email, and I'll be happy to help you or help answer the questions.
Ja, vielen Dank, Giel Tetteler. Ich hoffe, es ist für dich in Ordnung, wenn ich jetzt auf Deutsch rede. Verstehen alle anderen mich auch wieder besser wahrscheinlich, als wenn ich jetzt Englisch anfange. Du verstehst ja Deutsch, insofern können wir bestimmt die Fragen dann auch auf Deutsch vorlesen, ja, und gegebenenfalls antwortest du einfach auf Englisch. Das sollte ja auch kein Problem sein. Vielen Dank zunächst mal für den sehr klaren und, glaube ich, auch für viele hier erhellenden Vortrag. Da waren viele Dinge dabei. Ich glaube, mancher Ausatmen gehört zu haben, erleichtert. Oh Mann, das ist ja vielleicht doch gar nicht so schwierig, wie es auf dem Papier den Anschein hat. Und ich finde es auch gut, dass du zur Verfügung stehst für weitere Fragen, sodass man auf dich zukommen kann, wenn man hier Fragen hat noch zum weiteren Vorgehen. Ja, ich habe schon gehört, im Chat sind einige Fragen. Ich gucke auch hier in die Runde. Ja, wir haben hier auch 3 Fragen. Dann fangen wir erstmal hier kurz an. Ich kann insgesamt nur 3 nehmen. Jetzt erstmal, wir steigen dann ja in die Diskussion und dann geht es weiter. Ja, inhaltlich, Augenblick, fangen wir mit Josef Haber an, das habe ich zuerst gesehen eben. Augenblick, wir machen mal eben, sonst muss ich es übersetzen.
Wie kann ich sicher sein, dass die Daten, die ich euch gebe, vertraulich behandelt werden? How can I be sure that there is data confidentiality?
So firstly, obviously, we sign the necessary confidentiality documentation. So when you sign a contract with a notified body, there's a confidentiality NDA agreement that's included in that, which binds obviously the auditors that we have, us and you. Secondly, I think if we look at how we store the documentation, we obviously follow the necessary security protocols and information. So in that regard, the information that you send us is just sent to the auditors. We're not allowed, both by the specific legal requirements of FPR and the contract that we signed, to share that with anyone else. And obviously, in terms of IT security, we follow the necessary international guidelines. What I would also say is, I think there's a difference sometimes between what you have to send to a notified body to prove that the product is safe and all the information on the specific formulation. So we just need to know what ingredients are in there. And at a high level, what the manufacturing process is. That doesn't mean you have to send us every specific step. And so in that regard, I would also say the most confidential information is typically not necessarily what you have to send to the notified body. The bigger thing is obviously your field trial reports that prove efficacy, which are less confidential. At the same time, in truth, it doesn't matter what you send us. It's confidential by law. It's confidential by obviously our own accreditation body, and we're audited for that. And we obviously have the necessary IT infrastructure in place to be able to protect that.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich gehe mal hier rüber. Noch eine Frage?
Danke. Melanie Bremer, DHD Consulting. Ja, danke für den klaren und verständlichen Vortrag. Ich habe eine Frage, oder die ich mir stelle. Die technischen Unterlagen und die ganze Kommunikation kann ja in der Landessprache sein oder sollte in der Landessprache sein, laut Verordnung. Wenn ich jetzt das alles in Griechenland mache und das rein theoretisch auf Griechisch habe und ich habe dann eine Marktüberwachung in Spanien, wie verstehen die das, wenn ich das alles, ich muss das 5 Jahre aufbewahren und dann komme ich in die spanische Kontrolle und ja, danke.
So there's 2 parts to answer the question. The first one is that there's some information for specific countries that you have to translate. So the label, if you sell that in Spain, obviously will have to be in Spanish, and then France have to be in French. But let's say that the Greek Market Surveillance Authority requests your technical file and you submit that in German and they say, I can't read German. That's not your problem. That's their problem. And so what we see also in other sectors is that they then go out and either translate it, or what typically happens is that they will then call the German Market Surveillance Authority to check and have basically for a consult. So we see this in other sectors as well, and where we're a notified body as well, that there is partnership between the different market surveillance authorities, but it's not like it's your obligation for your costs to have a technical file in all the 24 languages that we have now in the EU. That's not a requirement. So what we see at the moment is the biggest language barrier is what is the language of the notified bodies. So unfortunately, because there's no German notified body at the moment, there is no notified body that accepts files in German. So in our case, it has to be in English or French or Italian, but unfortunately not German. So that for some manufacturers will be a barrier, but for the market surveillance authorities, they have to somehow figure out a way, maybe take a German course. Yeah.
Good answer. Many thanks. Ja, und dann nehmen wir noch eine Frage aus dem Chat eben. Augenblick.
Another question, is there a template? Gibt es da ein Template oder ein Guidance-Dokument für die technische Dokumentation? Ist das verfügbar?
So firstly, the commission is actually working on a document that will specifically be called Guidance for Technical Documentation. Now, unfortunately, because it's the commission, it will take a bit longer before that is ready. There's not guidance yet for the specific technical documentation, but flipping it on its head, what I would say is for biostimulants, if you have the test reports, the information per CMC, which of course differs a little bit, but there are very clear guidelines per CMC that we can give on what information you have to send us, and the field trials, where of course there's the technical specifications. I think that there is sufficient guidance there. There isn't a single document. We do have a form if you certify with us that we just ask this specific information, including for the specific CMCs, what information we want you to upload. But there is not a unified guidance document yet on technical documentation. So what I would say is if that's something that they want to know, what we can do is set up the Teams call to, like I said, run through what ingredients they might have and then explain what information we want.
Ja, vielen Dank. So, damit wären wir jetzt mit den inhaltlichen Fragen erstmal durch. Die 3 Fragen, die wir an der Stelle jetzt zugelassen haben. Ich würde jetzt vorschlagen, wir steigen direkt in die Diskussion ein, die jetzt diesem Blog folgt. Gibt es zunächst einmal Diskussionsbedarf, weitere Fragen zu dem Vortrag, den wir heute als erstes gehört haben, zur regulatorischen Einordnung von Biostimulantien? Das wäre jetzt nochmal ein Punkt, dass wir hier nochmal einsteigen. Gibt es dazu noch irgendwelche Rückfragen oder Diskussionsbedarf? Ich gucke jetzt Frau Draken an, die den Chat im Auge hat. Im Chat ist gerade nichts. Gut. Damit wären wir auch gleich, ich wollte dem Vortrag wenigstens die Chance geben, dass es dazu auch noch Fragen gibt. Damit wären wir aber dann gleich wieder bei dir, Gil. Dann eröffne ich an der Stelle die Fragerunde wieder, um zu sagen, gibt es hier noch weiteren Diskussionsbedarf? Und ich weiß, dass es hier durchaus noch genau 2 Fragen gab. Ich gehe mal erst darüber. Vielleicht stellen Sie sich kurz auch vor, das fand ich eben ganz günstig.
Mein Name ist Anke König-Wingenfeld, ich komme von SCC GmbH. Wir hatten ja schon auch Kontakt gehabt, glaube ich. Ich habe eine grundsätzliche Frage bezüglich der Wirksamkeitsversuche. Die Wirksamkeitsversuche haben ja einmal einen generellen Standard, also um das Design quasi festzulegen der Versuche, und dann müssen die einzelnen Claims ja dargestellt werden oder bewiesen werden. Ich habe jetzt eine Frage bei der Dossiererstellung. Ist es nötig, so wie ich Sie jetzt verstanden habe, reicht es Ihnen quasi aus, die einzelnen Versuche nur zu liefern? Oder ist es quasi verpflichtend, weil man ja von einem Dossier spricht, dass man die Versuche zusammenfasst und Ihnen dann quasi eine Zusammenfassung der erforderlichen Versuche liefert? Weil das ist ja dann auch für den Antragsteller mehr Arbeit.
Vielen Dank.
That's the field trials. Do you have to combine them, right?
Yeah. The question was if you send the dossier that you either send the single trials to you, is that sufficient, or is it necessary to summarize the trials and put them in a dossier together?
It's not necessarily to summarize the trials as a whole. So if you just send us nine field trial reports, 2 or however many that you want for the claims that you want to prove, that's enough. Of course, what we will then do is go through each of the trials, see for the specific claim that you want to prove, is there the necessary evidence? And then we will, I would almost say internally, make that summary of, is there enough trials to prove the claim that you want to prove? So it's not required to make a summary. Of course, in some cases, if you have very much a lot of trials, if you make a summary, it might make our assessment time shorter. And so that's something I can't give you the exact answer for. What I would say is if we're talking 50, 60 trials, if you make a summary, inherently that might for us be easier to go through. But for the assessment, it makes no difference because we have to read all the individual reports anyway.
So, dann geht es hier noch weiter.
Joschka Gerendasch von K+S hier in Kassel. Ich habe eine Frage auch zu den Feldversuchswesen. Wenn ich jetzt als Hersteller zum Beispiel 20 Feldversuche anlege, ne, bei 15 ist nichts rausgekommen, bei 5 habe ich einen positiven Effekt und ich schicke Ihnen nur die 5 Ergebnisse. Also ich meine, wie weit vertrauen Sie denn den Antragstellern in ihre Feldversuchs-Reports? Ne?
Ja. Good question.
Ja.
So I think that it's a very good question. What I would say is on the fourth slide, what I did say is there's a large responsibility for the manufacturer for you to send us the information and to be confident that the product will actually do something. Now, in theory, if you send us tomorrow a file with 5 field trial reports that meet all the requirements, you'll get a certificate. And that'll be the case for all the notified bodies, because we don't know that you maybe have done 15 trials that don't meet the requirements. Because, of course, we're not a national government, we're not a policing authority, and so we are not going to go into your files and check, is there something hidden away under the couch? And so in the theoretical sense, what I would say is you can probably get a Module B certification with 5 field trials that meet the requirements and 15 that don't, if you don't send us the 15. But of course, then comes the question, what happens if a market surveillance authority knocks on your door? Because they've gotten reports that your biostimulant is not doing what supposedly the label claims that it does. Well, they have the legal right to simply ask for your technical documentation. Now, of course, if you only then send them the 5 field trial reports and you don't send them the 15, then they can't really do anything. Of course, they are the national government authority, so maybe they could, if there's, for example, via court order that they could request the files. That hasn't happened in any of the other sectors yet, that they're that aggressive. So I don't think there's not a one-to-one answer, but in essence, if you have the field trial reports that prove conformity, even if you have other ones that don't, you would get certification. And then market surveillance and maybe within the associations might be a fora to discuss, is that something that we want? Is there something that we have to do against that? For the notified bodies, we just do what the FPR says that we have to check. And so in that regard, yeah, that is perhaps a flaw.
Okay. Yeah, further questions? Stellen Sie sich auch kurz vor.
Stefan Gessinger, DHD Consulting, hallo. Mich würde mal interessieren, ist es notwendig, die Feldversuche räumlich und zeitlich in irgendeiner Art und Weise zu verteilen? Also wenn wir jetzt an Pflanzenschutzmittelversuche denken, haben wir die Epozonen, ja, da müssen unterschiedliche klimatische und Bodenbedingungen berücksichtigt werden. Ist das hier auch der Fall? Und eine räumliche Trennung vielleicht, ja. Abstand von einem Jahr oder einer Vegetationsperiode oder sowas?
No. No. So no. So there's no, for example, geographical restrictions. So if you have field trial reports just from Germany, you get a certificate which allows you to sell the product in Spain, right? So that's already something that where if you look at plant protection products, it's a bit simpler. But in terms of the years, if you have field trial reports from 4 years ago, we will ask you to declare that the formulation is the same. And that's something as a manufacturer that you do have to make sure that it is, right? So if you've changed the product after 2 years, those field trial reports possibly might no longer be effective. But if you've been making the same product for 7 years and you have field trial reports from 6 years, 5 years, 4 years ago, you can use those reports as long as they meet the requirements of the technical specifications. And the technical specifications don't have requirements for expiry dates or indeed, for example, geographical locations.
Danke. Da hinten war noch eine Meldung. Da gehe ich jetzt mal hin.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich würde gerne an die Frage anschließen. Wäre es okay, Versuchsergebnisse sozusagen einem Dossier beizugeben, die eben nicht aus der EU und erweitert nicht aus Europa kommen?
Yeah, if it's possible to use international trials that were not done in Europe.
Yeah. So at the moment, if we read the technical specifications, the answer is yes. And so if you're an American manufacturer and you have trials in the States, there's no requirement in the technical specifications that that's not allowed. So that would be allowed. And so in that regard, the no geographical restrictions that I just mentioned, that applies to the EU as well. So if you have trials from again, from the States, from Canada, which we're now getting applications for, those can be used.
Ja, vielen Dank. Kurze Frage, haben wir auch noch Fragen aus dem Chat?
Standards der FPA erfüllt. Gibt es die Möglichkeit, woanders noch zertifiziert zu werden?
Okay, understood the question.
So it does depend a little bit on where it doesn't meet the requirements. So if we get a file with a test report and, for example, the pathogen content is too high, there's no way to go around that. But of course, if we get a file where the field trials don't exactly meet the requirements from the technical specifications, but you have, for example, other evidence, or you used other standards for performing the field trials, that is allowed. But then you have to, as a manufacturer, think about, well, what standard am I using? How am I proving efficacy? And so these technical specifications, they're not the only solution. And so I would say if for some reason it doesn't meet the requirements from the technical specifications, look at where it doesn't meet the requirements, for example, and then discuss with the notified body whether that's allowed. To give just one example, the standards at the moment say you have to hire a CRO to do the field trials, but what if you as a company have done the field trials internally with your own resources? Is that allowed? Possibly. If you have the evidence, if you can make it objective and you can prove the results, then possibly it will be allowed to use your own trials rather than ones with a CRO. But of course, depends on a case-by-case basis.
Ja, das ist tatsächlich, glaube ich, noch eine recht schwammige Geschichte, die uns allen noch sehr schwerfällt zu verstehen. Müssen jetzt die Versuche wirklich nach den harmonisierten Standards oder aktuell technische Spezifikationen erfolgen oder können auch andere Standards verwendet werden und wird das akzeptiert? Ja. Das ist tatsächlich eine große Schwierigkeit, die besteht. Also grundsätzlich ist es ja so, dass die harmonisierten Standards nicht verpflichtend sind, ja, sondern man kann auch andere Methoden verwenden, aber ist dann immer in der Situation, begründen zu müssen, warum habe ich das verwendet und warum ist es aus meiner Sicht vergleichbar mit dem, was ich bei den harmonisierten Standards im Ergebnis hätte. Ja, Augenblick, Josef Haber nochmal.
Ich habe eine praktische Frage. Wenn das Produkt zertifiziert ist, bringe ich das Label auf der Flasche an. Wenn das Produkt aber jetzt mit dem Saatgut verkauft wird, das heißt auf dem Saatgut angebracht ist oder auf dem Dünger angebracht ist, was mache ich dann mit dem Label? Muss ich das auf dem Saatgutsack aufkleben? Muss ich das auf der Düngerbox aufkleben? Wie stelle ich sicher, dass das Produkt dann gelabelt ist für den Verbraucher?
Okay, danke.
So that's if you have a biostimulant.
If you have a biostimulant which was applied to, for example, seed or whatever, where to put the label with a claim?
If we look at that from the FPR perspective, if you're applying, or for example, mixing a biostimulant with a fertilizer, it will become a blend. And so then what you have to do is on that product that you then sell as a blend, you have to put the label from both products. So you have to put the label from the biostimulant product that you might, as a blender, get from a different manufacturer. You have to put that on the blend and then put on the blend the label from, for example, the NPK. And then you just have to put both of those labels on the product. And you cannot even really amend those labels. So you have to keep them, essentially copy them verbatim.
Okay, jetzt darauf aufbauend wahrscheinlich die Frage. Ja, Dirk Schröder.
Vielen Dank. Eine Frage, die sich da direkt anschließt. Es ist tatsächlich so, wenn man also zum Beispiel Harnstoff mit einem Biostimulanz behandelt, da wird der Harnstoff ja nicht zu einem anderen Produkt. Also von daher ist es dann kein PFC7. Da sind wir in einem Bereich, der, glaube ich, noch nicht geregelt ist, eigentlich.
Frage verstanden?
So if it's not a blend, so if you're, for example, coding it and for whatever, or you're just mixing it and for whatever reason you cannot call it a blend, then the end product has to be one of the other 6 PFCs, and so then it can be a fertilizer, but then of course then the biostimulant has to be a CMC. So then, for example, it might have to be REACH registered. It might have to be a biostimulant that's just a plant extract. Either way, it has to be listed as a CMC ingredient. And so then if you're doing that and you're selling it as a PFC, as a fertilizer, so as PFC1, then you cannot put any claims on the label. What you can, of course, also do is sell a biostimulant that has nutrients, but then you cannot put the NPK values on the biostimulant label. What I would say is if you're combining in whatever way 2 products, so that one that is labeled as PFC1 and one that is labeled as 6, so a fertilizer and a biostimulant, in almost all cases it can be a blend. Even if that's an example that we've seen, if you're combining 2 granular products.
Ja, vielleicht ganz kurz dazu. Weil ich ja persönlich auch an der einen oder anderen Stelle zum Beispiel bei der Erstellung des Labeling Guidance Dokuments dabei war bei der Kommission. Das, was damals diskutiert wurde, das war, dass es immer auf die Funktion letztendlich ankommt. Also ich kann auch ein Blend verschiedener Funktionen haben. Das heißt, ich habe ein Produkt, das erfüllt die Funktion Düngemittel und, also PFC1 beispielsweise, und das gleiche Produkt erfüllt aber auch noch die Funktion Biostimulanz. Dann muss ich quasi meine Konformitätsprüfung zu beiden Produkten machen, also einmal eine Konformitätsprüfung hinsichtlich PFC1 und einmal eine Konformitätsprüfung hinsichtlich PFC6, und dann darf ich auch beides quasi auf meinem Produkt ausloben, auch wenn es kein Blend ist. Ja, also das ist aus meiner Sicht geregelt. Augenblick, ja. Sonst verstehen, ja.
Aber soweit ich es verstanden habe, ist es dann es gibt ja auch im Beispiel zu dem Guidance-Dokument eben Mineraldünger mit Biostimulanz, und dann ist das ein Label, was beides aufführt. Ne?
So. Ja, würde ich an der Stelle auch so sehen. Aber vorhin war ja die Frage auch, glaube ich, eher auf Saatgut gemünzt, und an der Stelle Saatgut hat ja doch wieder ein anderes, da fallen dann nicht beide Produkte unter die gleiche Verordnung, sondern deswegen war das, glaube ich, ein Sonderfall, ne, an der Stelle. Ja, hier haben wir noch eine Stellensicht bitte auch eben.
Ja, Timo Blecher, Firma Feldsaat-Freudenberger. Das wäre jetzt nämlich genau mein Punkt, weil bei Düngern ist es natürlich die Sache, dass der Dünger ja auch durch die EU-Verordnung geregelt wird, Saatgut aber nicht. Saatgut muss nach dem Saatgutverkehrsgesetz in den Markt gebracht werden, und da wäre schon die interessante Frage, ob ich dann zusätzlich an den Sack das Zusatzlabel für die Biostimulanz machen kann, und, was ich gerade nicht einschätzen kann, ob das nach Saatgutverkehrsgesetz überhaupt erlaubt ist. Das heißt, ob es da schon die richtige Schnittstelle gibt. Also ich glaube, die Frage ist so noch nicht so ganz einfach zu klären.
Ja, und Herr Blecher, ich habe auch sehr das Gefühl, dass wir die heute wahrscheinlich nicht klären können. Ja. Giel, ich glaube, dazu kommt von deiner Seite wahrscheinlich auch nicht wirklich viel, oder?
No, so the one practical example that I would add that just maybe it might help clarify it is completely different product group, but inhibitors. The manufacturer has a product that is both a urease inhibitor and a nitrification inhibitor. So what we're doing now is certifying it as both, and then with those 2 certificates, it becomes a blend. And then what we still have to check is how exactly that gets labeled. That's something that even we haven't exactly defined yet, because it is obviously it's a bit of a gray area. But within the next few months, obviously that's a product that we will certify. And what it looks like now is that the label will indeed just be a PFC7 mention, but that's also for a specific manufacturer. So it's something that still has to be worked out. What I would say is, if there are these types of questions and you send them to us, if we don't immediately have an answer, there, of course, we and IVA and different associations are in talks with the Commission. So we do obviously also try and get the answers to you. We might not always have them immediately, but it is something that we help with, and more importantly, obviously, the associations help with.
Ja, ich glaube, das ist noch ein ganz wichtiger Punkt. Vielen Dank, Giel. Dass Grundsätzlich, wenn wirklich Fragen aufkommen, EFCI ist ja auch Mitglied in der Coordination Group der Notified Bodies, dann können diese Fragen mit Sicherheit entweder bestimmt über den IVA oder eben auch persönlich auch mal an EFCI geschickt werden, um die Dinge vielleicht auch in der Coordination Group zu adressieren und vielleicht auch für Lösungen oder nach Lösungen zu suchen und zu gucken, ist das tatsächlich ein praktisches Problem, wofür irgendeine Lösung gefunden werden muss. Ja, ich glaube, das ist noch ein Thema. Ich hätte selber noch eine Frage, Gil, und zwar hinsichtlich der Änderung einer Formulierung. Ja, ich ändere eine Formulierung und muss mich dann ja gegebenenfalls wieder an die notifizierte Stelle wenden, um zu sagen, hier eine Änderung. Wie ist das denn eigentlich, wenn ich quasi nur einen Inhaltsstoff noch nicht mal ändere, sondern ich habe nur einen anderen Lieferanten, der mir den gleichen Inhaltsstoff liefert? Ja. Muss ich sowas auch tatsächlich dann melden?
That is definitely a gray area. And it depends a little bit on the product. So if you have a biostimulant and it's based on a plant extract and you're simply saying, I'm getting that plant extract from somewhere else, we won't say you have to redo the field trials. But if you just have an MPK and one of the ingredients for the MPK is ammonium nitrate and you're switching to a completely different supplier, I'm not sure whether we wouldn't ask for a reassessment, at least of the heavy metal values. But what I would say more often than not, and that's something that we definitely want to discuss with the coordination group, is to say, look, in some cases, whether it's a change or, for example, it's two formulations of a product where the only difference is a colorant, does it require two certificates or can it be one? So I don't have an answer. There are certainly options to say, well, we don't want to, we don't want to require recertification in that regard. But there will also be cases, especially in the simpler products, when we're just talking about heavy metals, where we say, look, it's more proportional to just ask for retesting. So to some extent, we have to sort of figure that out a bit on a case-by-case basis now and then come to some kind of common agreement.
Ja, vielen Dank für die ehrliche Antwort. Ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob das jetzt gerade wirklich wahnsinnig viel hilft, weil wir bewegen uns weiterhin in einem Graubereich. Ja? Und weil natürlich jeder Hersteller dann selber überlegen muss, melde ich das jetzt oder melde ich das nicht? Ja, der eine oder andere wird dann vielleicht eher sagen, ich mache es lieber nicht, dann habe ich auch kein Problem. Es kann durchaus sein. Ja? Also das ist tatsächlich, glaube ich, ein Thema, was uns wahrscheinlich noch ein bisschen beschäftigen wird. Ja. So, dann, jetzt haben wir nochmal, ich sehe schon, 2 Fragen. Das ist ein Thema, das bewegt hier viele. Ich gehe nochmal kurz.
Ich würde gerne den ersten Vortrag nochmal aufgreifen, wenn das in Ordnung wäre.
Ja? Können wir dann, ich behalte das eben im Hinterkopf, ist in Ordnung, aber dann können wir vielleicht, hier war noch die Frage, auch der erste? Ja. Ah, okay, alles klar. Haben wir dann noch irgendwas zu jetzt? Ja, Frau Henke sehe ich da hinten.
Hallo in die Runde, Katharina Henke von der Firma Phytoplanta. Ich würde mich gerne noch mal vergewissern zu den technischen Standards oder den Standards im Allgemeinen. Wie weit ist es inzwischen? Haben wir für alle Parameter, die FPR vorgibt, liegen inzwischen Standards vor oder gibt es da noch Lücken? Vielen Dank.
Ja, dem kann ich, glaube ich, auch schon vorgreifen. Ja. Die Lücken gibt es. Ja, also das ist... es werden ja die harmonisierten Standards auch zum Teil erst 2024 oder 2025 veröffentlicht. Bis dahin leben wir in vielen Bereichen mit technischen Spezifikationen, aber auch die gibt es nach wie vor nicht überall. Ja, und wie wir ja schon gesagt haben, es ist auch möglich, Hausmethoden zu verwenden, nationale Standards zu verwenden. Man muss eben dann nur im Einzelfall begründen, warum verwende ich diesen Standard und inwiefern sind die Ergebnisse, die aus diesen Analysen resultieren, vergleichbar mit dem, was gegebenenfalls dann in der technischen Spezifikation oder Ähnlichem steht. Gil, irgendwas zu ergänzen? Okay. Exactly. Okay, wunderbar. Vielen Dank. Okay, ja, auch noch zu dem Thema. Das ist einmal die letzte, weil danach gehe ich rüber nochmal wieder.
Eine Frage, die jetzt rückwirkend für mich nochmal gekommen ist. Sie haben eben gesagt, wenn der Händler ein eigenes Label draufklebt, ja, dann ist er ja Hersteller geworden, muss auch eine Notified Body kontaktieren, ja. Dann macht es ja Sinn, wenn er ein Letter of Access bekommt vom ursprünglichen Hersteller und damit ist er dann auch eben an diese Notification Body natürlich gebunden, wahrscheinlich. Macht Sinn aus meiner Sicht. Sie haben vorhin was zu Preisen und Zeitlinien gesagt. Wie wäre das in so einem Fall dann? Also gibt es dann eine Fast Track, gibt es dann einen Sonderpreis?
Die Frage kann ich nur weitergeben.
Yes, exactly that. So I don't even think if you have a certificate with one company and then via a letter of access you go to another notified body, you would be attached. So if we get an application through an LOA with a product certified with a different notified body, I think we could probably rely on that. Regardless, if a manufacturer, say, Thomas produces a biostimulant, sells that to another company who slaps his own label on it, if we've provided the certification to Compo Expert, the certification costs for that dealer are probably 75% less. Obviously, it does have to be just a standard LOA and the product has to be the same. But if the product is the same and the standards are less, then there is a fast track because, of course, that's a very simple assessment and it's much cheaper because, of course, for us, we've already certified that product. Yeah. So with that, 500 euros, maybe a bit more, but that's about it. So that's nothing, yeah. And obviously in terms of timelines, it's a lot less.
Ich glaube, das war eine sehr wichtige Antwort, die dort gegeben wurde. So.